After World War II, there will be a number of radical art movements all across the world that really redefine what art is, how art is expressed, how art is experienced, and rewrite the rules of art. In many cases, these art movements don't get going until the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. But one of the most radical and the earliest was an organization in Japan that was known as the Gutai Art Association. They first formed in 1954 officially, although they've been doing things together, some of the members of the group, since 1951. And they lasted until 1972 when they officially disbanded. And they would be considered the most shocking Japanese art movement in the history of Japan at the time that they formed. And they really, I can't stress enough how radical they seemed to a quite conservative Japanese artistic environment and cultural environment. We're going to look at what they did, what they stood for, and why Jackson Pollock was so important to them, and how Jackson Pollock gets kind of credit for what Gutai wants to try to do. In August of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in the cities of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, and that brought an end to World War II and devastated Japan, instantly killing within the first month about 200,000 people and inflicting all kinds of suffering on the nation, which was already suffering after so many years of war anyway. The economy was shattered. Americans came in and occupied the country, and its former status as this great empire had been destroyed. And so what you had by the end of World War II is a nation that, unlike the US, lost the war and had to deal with the consequences of coming to terms with that, coming to terms with who it was as a nation, coming to terms with the atrocities that had been committed during the war, both against them, but more importantly by them. You know, who are we as a people? What does this mean for us? And so it was kind of this extended period of national introspection, and meanwhile, the institutions of the nation were really in flux, and it was a huge amount of change. One consistency for the nation was that the emperor, Hirohito, who had been the emperor prior to the war and had been responsible for it, was actually kept in power. The United States thought it was important for him to be a stabilizing force in the region. They were worried about Japan possibly becoming a communist nation. And so, as part of this Cold War strategy, they maintained the emperor. His title changed from emperor to a constitutional monarch, but it provided a base level of normalcy for this country that was undergoing just huge upheavals in its self-conception. After the war, during the 10 years after the war, there was a large U.S. presence in Japan, not only militarily, but economically and culturally. As I mentioned before in the Abstract Expressionist PowerPoint, the United States government was very keen on promoting the idea of freedom, of democracy, and of capitalism. And so one of the ways that they did that is they promoted the cultural superiority of the United States through art shows. And abstraction equaled freedom in this world where totalitarian regimes preferred realism and social realism. And in fact, before the war, that had been where the imperial Japanese government had been headed. So this was a calculated decision on the US's part to embolden people through the freedom of abstraction. And the State Department got together exhibitions of abstract art from the United States and traveled them around to Europe and to Japan and other parts of the world. In 1951, an exhibition of the work of Jackson Pollock was part of a larger group show in Japan, and it was a watershed moment for a group of young artists who viewed his work and viewed his process more important than the work itself as a way towards their own artistic freedom, towards a way of freeing them from centuries of what they kind of thought of as artistic oppression under this very constrained Japanese system. This show by Jackson Pollock had an enormous influence on one artist in particular. And he was a man who was in his late 40s. His name was Jiro Yoshihara, and he lived in the city of Osaka, where his family owned a very successful cooking oil business. So he came from money, but he was an artist. He was somebody who had been a painter before the war and was very fascinated by Western painting traditions, by European painting traditions in particular. And he was part of a group of young artists in his 20s when he began his fascination with European painting. He particularly was drawn to surrealism, this painting style of the mind. And this is one of his surrealist paintings from the 1930s before World War II happened. So after the war and in 1951, inspired by this work by Jackson Pollock, he gathered a group of young artists in Osaka around him, and they started what was called a contemporary art discussion group. And what they did is they talked about the ideas that they viewed as inherent in the work of Pollock. They were interested in international art trends, and this was a key to him. He thought that he wanted to reach out internationally to create bonds of friendship between artists from every nation, and that would prevent a war again in the future. This idea of just connecting with outsiders and putting patriotism and love of country behind you and thinking globally. So, these were his ideas underlying this artistic enthusiasm he had for Pollock itself. The two major kind of mantras that came out of this discussion group was never imitate. He felt like Pollock was not imitative of anybody, that he had discovered his own true style, and that kind of going along hand in hand with this, create what has never existed before. That's the artist's true task, is to create something that had never previously been a part of the discussion. And that could be a physical object, it could be an action, it could be an idea. So he was very broad about how he thought about art and thought about creation. And these ideas formulated for several years until 1954, when he helped to organize this group that they took the name Gutai. And then 2 years later, after 1954, they wrote a manifesto about Gutai art. Gutai itself means embodiment or concreteness. And the two words that come together in Japanese that form the name are gu and tai, as I've laid out here in these bullet points, a tool or a means, and then body or substance. So it's this idea of merging yourself with your medium and creating an important balance. So these artists were fascinated by not only the abstract expressionists, but by untrained artists, by children's art especially, about this idea of not having a preconceived idea about art, about, again, being expansive and open to the possibilities. And one way that they viewed that is that they looked at things that had been damaged. And this was particularly easy to do in the landscape of post-war Japan, where, Allied planes had inflicted a lot of damage. And seeing in that damage not destruction, but beauty and potential, and this idea that what decay and ruins brings out is the inner nature of the matter, the medium, what it's made of, and it allows it to shine through, and without the veneer of finish or the veneer of whatever the human had tried to create out of it. So this idea was one of the founding principles of Gutai, that damage and destruction was creation. It was a form of creation, and it created beauty. So to summarize what the Gutai were about, what that manifesto states, and it says a lot of stuff, and this is not their language, this is my language, but the idea is that there's a collaboration between physical action and material. And that's what they got from Jackson Pollock. That's what they got from looking at the photographs of him flinging paint in the middle of his canvases, the photos by Hans Nemeth that made him so well known. And that's what they mean by embodiment and by this spirit of collaboration, is that you're collaborating with the material. It's you, the artist, and the material, and you together meet and you create a new thing, an undiscovered world. This next thing is actually their words. Gutai is for a collective spirit of individuality, and that might seem contradictory, and that would be fine because Gutai is sometimes contradictory, but it's this idea of, again, like minds coming together to each support each other to create their own realities. It's the opposite of, say, communism, a collective spirit of collectivity, right? This is so that your own individual creation can shine through. These are the actual words of Gutai as expressed in their manifesto that I tried to summarize in my first bullet point on the previous slide. But what they say is, in Gutai art, the human spirit and the material shake hands with each other but keep their distance. The material never compromises itself with spirit. The spirit never dominates the material. When the material remains intact and exposes its characteristics, it starts telling a story and even cries out. To make fullest use of the material is to make use of the spirit. Part of that's kind of based in a Shinto belief in kind of an animist view of the universe and spirits being part of the world, and the spirit being the material manifest, or the material being the spiritual manifest. So it doesn't come out of left field. It's kind of very Japanese and traditional Japanese in one sense, but the way that they're applying it to the art world is quite unique. One of the goals of the organization of Gutai was to produce journals that expresses their ideas, that illustrated their art, that promoted their ideas about this meeting of the creator and the material in this halfway place. And so they published these journals. There were 14 issues in all, and it really embodied their concept of internationalism, because what they did with them is they went through magazines that they could get their hands on, and they found addresses of artists and of curators and of galleries, and they sent them abroad, and they sent them far and wide. They sent them to South America, they sent them to North America, to France, to England, wherever they heard of people, to Italy, groups of people. They wanted to reach out because, again, they wanted to foster this international sense of connection. And for them, this was an important way to do that. When people couldn't necessarily travel halfway around the world, then their ideas at least could travel. Today we have the internet, and think back when they didn't exist. You can't do that, but I can. And anyway, so these were important to them. And in fact, after Jackson Pollock died and they were doing an inventory of his library, he received a Gutai journal from the group that mailed it to him in New York. Yoshihara was the intellectual and kind of philosophical center of the group of Gutai. He was the oldest, he was the one with the most experience, and so he kind of looked at himself as a mentor to the younger artists. He was also the wealthiest, and so he was able to fund a lot of their activities because, as you'll see, one of the issues with their work is that they're not creating work that's going to be sold. So this is it's individual art, but it's not art that's within any market system, at least at first. The market will later catch up with them and they'll make works that are sold. But at first, their works are mostly performance and durational art that doesn't really have a market for it. So he provided funding, and of course that's always important. One of my favorite things about Yoshihara is that for about the last 15 years of his life, and he died in 1972, which is when they officially end Gutai with his death, so that's sort of, he's the heart of it. But for the last 15 years of his life, he painted circles, and that's all he painted. He went through a brief kind of abstract expressionist phase in his early years of Gutai in the early 50s, but then he became focused on the circle, and he just painted circle after circle after circle after circle to the neglect of everything else. And so it became his sort of mission in life to paint this sign, this zero, this roundness, and that's what he devoted the rest of his life to in terms of his artistic production as an individual. The next couple slides, I'll show you some of his circles. No two circles are alike, as you'll see. You vary the color, the size, the texture. Circles that look like bagels, that look like circular pretzels. Some circles that aren't even completely circles, but are circular. Circles, circles, circles. I think the purest expression of the Gutai philosophy of individual and material probably comes in these mud paintings done by Kazuo Shiraga. Kazuo Shiraga would later turn to painting, and today he is the most successful of the artists associated with Gutai. I mean, he's dead, but his paintings are now very highly valued and in major collections all over the world. But he began more with these mud paintings as this kind of fundamental, elemental struggle with materials and trying to get it to do what you want it to do. If any of you are studio majors or have taken a studio class, you know that making art is hard. You know, it doesn't, that line doesn't go as straight as you want it, or you know, that pot that you're trying to throw just doesn't want to bend to your will. And it's the struggle. It's the struggle that you have to get into the mindset of the material. The material has to get into you. You have to find this balance. And that's what these mud paintings are all about. It's him struggling, and it's like Pollock in his painting. It's like a lone person struggling against the world. It's just, you know, this here we are, a spiritual being trapped in a material body, and he acts all of that out in the mud. He doesn't act it out. I don't mean to say that it's he's pretending. I mean, that's like literally his action is that. It's this human condition of here we are and we are engaged in struggle. This idea will also be present in existentialism when we talk about French artists particularly, but they didn't call it existentialism in Japan. When Shiraga made these paintings, it was for an audience, either an audience in person that was there to view it, or it was filmed. And the audience idea is important because he is doing this for you. He's doing this for us. He is struggling to show you the way, to show you a union of his soul with the material. And so there's a teaching component to this. What's unique about the paintings that Shiraga created is that he painted with his feet, and that was an attempt to get beyond rational control of the medium. I mean, he had some sort of control because he was manipulating these brushes and these rags that were attached to his feet. Sometimes it was just his feet. Um, and thinking about what he was doing, but also he didn't have the same type of motor control over his feet as you do over your hands. I mean, just you can stop right now and take a break and try to pick up a pencil with your toes and write your name. And you see that it's not quite the same as if you do it with your right or left hand. So he is giving up control while he retains a little bit in an effort again to sort of meet it somewhere. He often, after falling a lot, he ended up hanging onto ropes that he would suspend from the ceiling in order to stabilize himself. And so that's what he uses to swoosh this paint and move across the surface of these paintings. Some works are quite big, like the one he was working on in that photograph that we just saw, and then some are rather, regular canvas size to smaller. They vary in size, but these are the works that still exist, the works that are now selling for great sums and that honestly look great. I've seen a number of them in museums. I saw a gallery show of his work in New York a few years back, and they're just explosive and beautiful, and they still have this vitality to them that I know I've seen a lot of abstraction in my life, and these excite me still. Here's two more. And he did these really for the rest of his life. He died 2008, I believe, was when he died, and he just got better and better. He does use a lot of deep, rich reds and darker tones, so that might make it a little bit more uh, dramatic, I think. Here's two more. Just enjoy their lusciousness. Yoshida is another artist associated with Gutai, and he did a work titled Red from 1954, and this is it. It is a painting on a wood panel. It's red, and then he hammered a couple nails in there and tied a string to it. And so it sort of expresses this thingness about itself, about these materials. It is what it is, and it's an expression of that. Toshio Yoshida today is more well known for these burn paintings that he did, where he used charcoal or other types of iron implements, and he would burn these marks into the wood. He would move the coals around. He would leave some longer than others to get a darker color. But it was this form where he was sort of in control, but also sort of not in control. So there are about 25 to 30 different artists associated with Gutai. Some became more well known than others. Probably Shiraga is the most well known. Murakami, who we'll see, Atsuko Tanaka we'll also look at. But certain ones are known for like a one thing. So Toshio Yoshida, his burn paintings are kind of what he's known for. Um, Others artists worked more collaboratively with others and aren't really remembered that much for any one contribution. Shozo Shimamoto is also an artist who's pretty well known, and for the most part, I've just picked out well-known artists in this brief presentation of Gutai. I also included a video of Shimamoto from 2000 and something 8, I think, which is about 5 years before he died. So it's an old Shimamoto, and he's making one of his paintings. So you can watch that, watch the process itself. I think it's kind of fascinating. And he's also revered now at this old age and as this great innovator. He was later, after he after Gutai ended in 1972, he became very involved in mail art and sending art correspondences through the mail, and it's kind of a natural extension of the Gutai interest in sending their journals, I think. So I think it developed out of that, plus the idea that mail art is not a fine art, but is a participatory art and connects people. That was an important idea for Shimamoto. So his early work consisted of this series of works where he would heavily paint these surfaces and then poke holes through them. So this is one of these early works from about 1954. Doesn't have a title, but it comes from the whole series of poking holes in the canvas. He's more well known for hurling these glass vials of color at canvases, and this very active, force of breakage and of this big collision and big splatter. He often uses very bright and vibrant colors, and it too is meant to be viewed. It's not just a painting to be done in the privacy of your studio, but it's meant to be performative. And so much of this, it combines two things, not only the finished product, but the act of creation. Then the act of creation is important and maybe is just as important as the finished product. This is what they ultimately come to learn through Jackson Pollock. Now, Pollock, of course, he didn't conceive of his as performance. He conceived of his as something that was really connected to himself, and he didn't want people watching him. He did it in his studio. But the members of Gutai felt like this needed to be experienced because the creative process helps the world through its energies. And it also, part of what the Gutai is doing is they're just breaking down barriers. They're breaking down these categories that say that an artist does this and an artist is highly trained. And they're saying you can get bottles of color and shatter them against the surface. You can burn coals on a wooden board. You can hammer a nail into something and tie a string to it. These are not elevated things. I did not have to go to art school for 12 years in order to do this. Art is about creation. It's the act of creation that is the crucial component here. And in a world that's, just experienced great destruction and death and devastation, it's this idea of this spark of hopefulness that comes with creation that they're really trying to get to as this sort of form of international peace. So it's ultimately very optimistic and very grounded in this sense of togetherness, collective creation. Two more spatter paintings. Akira Kanayama made drawings using robotics, using these machines that he constructed and then he controls from a remote control, like a toy car. And he manipulated it so that it went over the surface and created these dense drawings of lines just overlapping and overlapping and overlapping these dense jungles of color. And again, it's sort of in his control, but it's also sort of not. It's, a car will only move a certain way, and to manipulate it, you are dependent upon the battery and dependent upon these things that are outside of your immediate control. So it's giving up some of that artistic control, and again, trying to connect with the machine. Here's another look at the operation of this machine and one of the products. I mean, admittedly, it's not very exciting art, probably, but this is one of those things where probably the experience of it is a little more interesting than the final product, for sure. One of the earlier works by Saburo Murakami is this one, and it's from 1954, and it's got some similarities to Shimamoto's work, where he's throwing the vials of kind of explosive color, but this is only one ball. So Murakami dips this ball in paint or ink and throws it at this surface, and you just get the one bam, and then that's it. So it's really understated and very muted. But this isn't where Murakami like continues to focus his work on. Instead, his work takes the form of breaking through these stretchers that have had butcher paper or like construction paper pulled across, and he then busts his way through. He kind of breaks on through to the other side, to quote the Doors, and it's this action of him in the space. It's kind of like Shiraga wrestling with mud in a way, except for these definitely reference the art world and art creation, painting in particular. And they are just this sort of toiling away of the individual through layer after layer after layer of these canvases. They are definitely performative because there's something very dramatic about breaking through these things. If you think about maybe your high school football experience where, the football players run out and bust through that banner. Uh, I mean, we still do that because there's something compelling about that image. And Murakami is acknowledging that early on in the 1950s by breaking through these surfaces, these layers, this idea of the picture plane. He renders it kind of neutral and three-dimensional. He turns a painting into a sculpture by busting through. And the performance itself is very fascinating to watch. So there were several occasions where the Gutai group had public performances that they organized as festivals for people to come and observe these things. But one of the intriguing things about Murakami's work is that the the final product ends up being very visually interesting. So even though it is just this, kind of paper bag material, this kind of construction paper things, the layers and the way that the paper drips and, well, not drips, but falls and lays after being broken through is turns out to be very visually interesting. So uh, you kind of have both that are on equal footing here. About 10 years ago, there was a big retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and that's where these photographs are taken. And um, there were these works by Murakami, and they were just completely compelling. Looking through them, sort of just being around them, they covered a whole passageway between different rooms. So the increase in the scale makes it very theatrical, dramatic. Atsuko Tanaka was one of several women involved with the Gutai group. It was not an entirely male group, but her work is the most well known in the West, particularly because she made some pretty dynamic things. In particular, it's this electric dress that she created that is made out of these neon tubes and that is actually plugged in when you wear it. And this is her wearing it on the right at one of these public Gutai performances. And it's just this over the top, frightening, kind of could electrocute you if you stepped in a puddle type of things that transforms the artist's body into walking electricity and walking spectacle. It's not the only one of these outfits that she created, but as far as I know, it's the only one that's been reconstructed. So on the previous slide, the image that was in color is the one that she reconstructed at a later date because the original got destroyed. But here are others of her creations at the time, and they're very contemporary. There's a contemporary artist named Nick Cave out of Chicago who creates these sound suits, and they completely transform the body. But you realize that Atsuko Tanaka had this idea of subsuming the identity of the walker, the performer, the person in the suit, you know, 40, 50 years before Nick Cave started doing it in Chicago. So here's some historic photographs of some of these really fantastic outfits that she made. Because the electric dress really became so well known and was such an icon of the Gutai movement, later on, Atsuko Tanaka made a number of drawings after the electric dress. These are some prints that she did in which she does these very colorful images that are all kind of related to kind of electrical currents and sort of wiring, and they have this kind of mechanical day glow feel to it. She's more than just the sound suit, though, the electric suit. She also did a film that depicted her making these circles, also kind of like circuitry, like the drawings that she did, titled "Round on Sand," in the at the edge of the ocean, which then comes up and destroys all of her hard work. She also did another piece that was very successful and popular titled Work Bell, in which she wired all of these bells that are like the chimes, like doorbells, basically. And you're instructed as the viewer to go and press a button. And when you press the button, it sets off this circuit of bells that ring in this space. And she described it as she's painting lines of sound, and you, the audience person, experience the sound as these different bells go off and envelop you in the total sound experience of it. In 1955, the members of Gutai organized what they called the Experimental Outdoor Modern Art Exhibition to challenge the burning midsummer sun, long name. Um, and they commandeered a public park in Tokyo, and they uh, constructed these installations of different types of things that are art, and they invited the public to come and engage with it. And these are some historic photographs from that. On the left, you see these banners that have footprints, and it's as if they're kind of instructional footprints that you're supposed to follow. But as you can see, they go up into the trees and weave their way through the treetops, so it's not really something that you can follow. And then on the right, there are these long cellophane hammock-like things that hold colored water. Unfortunately, the black and white photography of the time doesn't really capture the kind of strangeness of it. So they've been reconstructed since then. I told you that there was a big show at the Guggenheim, and the work on the right depicts the reconstructions by Sadamasa Motonaga, and you can see them. They kind of remind me of those frozen pops that you enjoy during the summertime. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, and there's some of them restrung in the park in Tokyo. The whole point is to fill the viewer with childlike wonder. They really love the idea of reconnecting with childhood, and that's one of the things that they looked to for inspiration was child art, child drawings, and just the child's perspective on art. That anything could be art. Tanaka Atsuko would dye these long sheets of just cotton sheets that you would buy at the store for your bed, and she would cut them up. She would dye them colors. She would sew them together, and then she would just hang them up as works of art, as if they were canvases, as you can see on the left. Or the work on the right is just this piece that's been dyed pink and then stretched as if it's stretched on a canvas, but then placed in the park as part of this outdoor exhibition. And it kind of looks like you should jump on it because it's like a trampoline, but it's not. You're just supposed to look at it. Part of the exhibition was participatory, so the work on the left is titled Work Nails, and one was painted white and one was painted red, and viewers were encouraged to pound nails into the surface. They also had um, it's not fireworks, but like smoke shows where artists, members of the Gutai would uh, make smoke rings. They constructed these machines that would make smoke rings, and then they would just sort of randomly engage these smoke machines to set off the rings that you see on the right. Kazuo Shiraga set up these poles in this conical configuration and painted them red, and then he took his axe and he stood in the middle and he just chopped and chopped and chopped and chopped into the white wood underneath the red to expose them, and that was the performance. Other forms of participatory art were works like on the left, where you were encouraged to just draw on this big, large board that had been set up, and they provided markers on them. And children, especially, were encouraged to engage with this. Or this, they created basically like a shadow theater underneath this this box, and people were encouraged to go in there and to create their own theatrical milieus, I guess, or little dramas, or just stand there and live their life, because that's what drama is just life. I think my favorite thing that they ever did, and this wasn't at the 1955 exhibition, but at a later one, they constructed a Gutai card box, which was almost like this automated thing. And so viewers were encouraged to plunk in a coin and then to select a button, and you would get an original painting by one of the members of Gutai. And these Gutai artists would actually be in the box, and then the button would be pressed, and then they would take a few minutes to make a painting, and then they would push it out the slot. And so people ended up with these small cards on which they had an original Gutai work of art. And it was kind of about just commercialism and, sort of their attempt to break free of this kind of capitalist art system. Another one of their ventures later on was the International Sky Festival in 1960. And in this piece, they invited a group of artists from a bunch of different countries to submit designs. And these designs were then transferred onto these banners, and then the banners were held aloft by big advertising balloons. And these are balloons that were used to advertise businesses. We still see them like those floaty guys outside of car dealerships and stuff, to just draw attention to a special event or something like that. And that was a Japanese thing. And so the Gutai took this and then they used it to create an art exhibition that was in the sky and that everybody could have access to. And that was the thing, making connections internationally, providing free art, making art something that was part of everyday life, making art something that was accessible to the people and not elitist and not part of a capitalist system. So that's going to do it. That's the end of Gutai for now. And then we are going to go on and look at some other post-war movements in other places.